In the grand halls of Valdoria Palace, where golden chandeliers cast dancing shadows on marble floors, secrets have always been the most valuable currency. For generations, the House of Ravencrest has ruled the kingdom of Valdoria with an iron fist wrapped in silk gloves. But when young Princess Elena discovers a letter that could destroy everything her family has built, she faces an impossible choice: protect the crown that will one day be hers, or expose a truth that could tear the kingdom apart. What happens when the very people sworn to protect the royal family become the ones who must decide their fate? When Captain Marcus Blackwood, the most trusted guard in the Royal Guard, stumbles upon evidence of a crime so shocking it shakes his loyalty to its core, he must choose between his oath to the crown and his duty to justice. In a world where power is everything and trust is a luxury few can afford, one revelation will set in motion a chain of events that will test every bond, challenge every belief, and force everyone to answer a single, devastating question. How far would you go to protect the truth, even if it means destroying everything you've sworn to defend? This is the story of how a single moment of courage can change the fate of an entire kingdom, and how sometimes the greatest enemies of the crown are those who wear it. The autumn rain drummed against the tall windows of Valdoria Palace, creating a symphony that had lulled Princess Elena Ravencrest to sleep many nights throughout her 22 years. Tonight, however, the sound only added to her restlessness as she paced her chambers, unable to shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Elena had always been different from her stepmother, Queen Isabel, and her half-brother, Prince Adrian. Where they were calculating and cold, she was compassionate and warm. Where they saw subjects to be ruled, she saw people to be served. Her father, King William, had once shared her idealistic view of monarchy, but years of Isabel's influence had slowly eroded his noble intentions. The princess paused at her writing desk, where correspondence from various charitable organizations lay scattered. She had been working late into the night, reviewing proposals for new orphanages and schools throughout the kingdom. It was work that Isabel openly mocked and Adrian dismissed as beneath their station, but Elena believed it was the very heart of what it meant to be royal. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. "Enter," she called, expecting to see her loyal lady-in-waiting, Margaret. Instead, a young chambermaid named Rose stepped into the room, her face pale and hands trembling. Rose was perhaps 16, with auburn hair and freckles that reminded Elena of her own younger years before the weight of royal responsibility had settled upon her shoulders. "Your Highness," Rose whispered, glancing nervously toward the door. I found something. I don't know what to do with it." Elena immediately moved to close the door behind Rose, noting the girl's obvious distress. "What is it, Rose? You can tell me anything." The chambermaid reached into her apron and withdrew a crumpled letter, its royal seal broken and its edges worn as if it had been read many times. "I was cleaning Prince Adrian's study, as I do every Tuesday evening. The letter was hidden behind some books, but it fell when I was dusting the shelves. I know I shouldn't have read it, Your Highness, but—" Elena gently took the letter from Rose's shaking hands. The moment she saw the handwriting, her blood ran cold. It was Adrian's distinctive script, but the words contained within were unlike anything she could have imagined her half-brother capable of writing. The letter was addressed to someone called J.M. and dated 3 weeks prior. As Elena read, her face grew increasingly pale. "The old merchant has finally agreed to our terms. The timber rights to the Westwood Forest are ours for half their true value. He had little choice after the unfortunate accident that befell his warehouse. Sometimes these small fires serve a greater purpose, as you well know. The insurance money he received was barely enough to cover his debts to us, and now he is grateful for any offer we make. Mother says we must accelerate our timeline. The East Bridge mining operation should face similar persuasion within the fortnight. Make it look natural, as you did with the others." Elena's hands began to tremble as she read on. "Father remains oblivious, as expected. His guilt over Mother's death makes him eager to please Isabel in all things. He truly believes these acquisitions are legitimate business dealings that will strengthen the kingdom's economy. How convenient it is that he has never questioned where the gold to fund these purchases actually comes from. The silver mines of Greyhold continue to produce beyond the official reports, and the extra revenue flows directly to our private accounts. The letter continued with more details about bribes, intimidation, and a network of corruption that seemed to stretch throughout the kingdom. But it was the final paragraph that made Elena sink into her chair. Elena suspects nothing, though she asks too many questions about the new mining operations near her precious orphanages. If she becomes a problem, we may need to consider more permanent solutions. After all, accidents can happen to anyone, even princesses. The kingdom would grieve, but they would also accept Adrian as the natural heir. Sometimes sacrifice is necessary for the greater good. Rose had been watching Elena's face with growing concern. "Your Highness, what does it say?" Elena looked up at the young woman who had risked so much to bring her this information. "Rose, you may have just saved my life, though I fear you may have put your own in danger by doing so." The princess stood and walked to her window, looking out at the kingdom she loved. Thousands of people lived their lives trusting that the royal family would protect and serve them. They had no idea that Prince Adrian and Queen Isabel had been systematically destroying the lives of honest merchants and landowners to build their own private fortune. "Your Highness, what should we do?" Rose asked. Elena turned back to face her. "We need proof of everything this letter claims, and we need someone we can trust completely." She paused, thinking of the various nobles and courtiers who surrounded the royal family daily. How many of them were involved in Adrian's schemes? How many could be trusted? Then she remembered Captain Marcus Blackwood of the Royal Guard. Marcus had served her father faithfully for 15 years, ever since he was a young soldier who had distinguished himself in the border wars. He was known throughout the kingdom for his unwavering integrity and personal code of honor. If anyone could be trusted with something this dangerous, it would be Marcus. "Rose, I need you to do something very important, but also very dangerous. Can I count on your discretion and courage?" The young woman nodded without hesitation. "Of course, Your Highness. After what I've seen tonight, I would do anything to help you." Elena moved to her writing desk and quickly penned a note. "Captain Blackwood, I require your immediate and private audience on a matter of utmost importance to the security of the realm. Please come to my chambers at midnight. Trust no one else with this message, and tell no one of our meeting. The fate of the kingdom may depend on your discretion." Princess Elena, she folded the note carefully and handed it to Rose. "Find Captain Blackwood and give this to him personally. Make sure no one sees you do it. Then return here and wait for him to arrive." As Rose left on her crucial mission, Elena began to pace again, but now her restlessness had transformed into determination. She thought about all the families who had suffered mysterious misfortunes in recent months. The merchant whose warehouse had burned, the farmer whose cattle had died from strange illness, the innkeeper whose tavern had been vandalized repeatedly until he was forced to sell. At the time, these incidents had seemed like unfortunate coincidences or perhaps the work of common criminals. Now Elena realized they were part of a calculated campaign of terror designed to force honest people to surrender their property and rights for far less than they were worth. Her half-brother Adrian had always been ambitious, but she had never imagined he was capable of such calculated cruelty. And her stepmother Isabel, who had married into the royal family after Elena's birth mother died in childbirth, had always been distant and cold, but Elena had attributed that to grief and the difficulty of raising a stepdaughter while managing the duties of a queen. Now she understood that Isabel's coldness masked something far more sinister. The woman had been systematically turning King William against his own principles while building a criminal empire that would ensure Adrian's power when he eventually took the throne. Elena moved to her wardrobe and selected a dark cloak. If she was going to fight this corruption, she needed to understand its full scope, and she needed allies who shared her commitment to justice, regardless of the personal cost. The clock in the corner of her room chimed 11:30. In 30 minutes, Captain Blackwood would arrive, and Elena would have to trust him with information that could either save the kingdom or get them both killed. She thought about her father, sleeping peacefully in his chambers, unaware that his wife and stepson were destroying everything he had tried to build during his reign. King William had always been a gentleman, perhaps too gentle for the harsh realities of ruling a kingdom. His trust in Isabel had blinded him to her true nature, and his guilt over Elena's mother's death had made him eager to please his new wife in all things. Elena realized that confronting her father directly would be useless. Isabel had spent years building his dependence on her judgment, and Adrian had carefully crafted an image of himself as the dutiful son and heir. Any accusations Elena made would likely be dismissed as jealousy or sisterly rivalry. No, she needed evidence that was so overwhelming and undeniable that even her father would be forced to confront the truth about his wife and stepson. Rose returned just as the clock struck midnight, followed moments later by the soft knock that announced Captain Blackwood's arrival. Marcus Blackwood was a man in his late 30s, tall and powerfully built, with dark hair that was beginning to show threads of silver at the temples. His face bore the weathered look of a soldier who had seen combat, but his eyes held the steady gaze of someone who had never compromised his principles, even when it would have been easier to do so. "Your Highness," he said, bowing respectfully as he entered the room. "Your message suggested urgency." Elena gestured for him to sit, then positioned herself where she could watch both the door and the windows. "Captain, what I am about to share with you will test your loyalty to the crown in ways you have never imagined. Before I begin, I need to know, is your oath to the throne itself or to the people who currently occupy it?" Marcus studied her face carefully before responding. "My oath is to the kingdom of Valdoria and its people, Your Highness. I serve the crown because it represents their interests and welfare. If the crown ever ceased to serve that purpose—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I would have to reconsider where my true duty lies." Elena nodded, relieved by his answer. "Then, I pray your integrity is as strong as your reputation suggests, because what I am about to show you will challenge everything you believe about this royal family." She handed him Adrian's letter and watched as his expression grew increasingly grim. When he finished reading, Marcus set the letter down carefully and looked at Elena with a mixture of anger and determination. "Your Highness, if this letter is genuine, then Prince Adrian and Queen Isabel are guilty of crimes that would see common citizens hanged for treason." "The letter is genuine," Elena replied. "Rose found it hidden in Adrian's private study. But a single letter is not enough to convince my father or bring these crimes to light. We need more evidence, and we need it quickly. According to this letter, I may not have much time before they decide. I am too dangerous to let live." Marcus stood and began to pace, his soldier's mind already working through the implications. If they are willing to orchestrate accidents and fires to intimidate merchants, they would certainly not hesitate to arrange a hunting accident or a fall from a horse for a princess who threatens their plans. "Exactly," Elena said, "which is why we must act swiftly and carefully. Captain, I need your help to investigate these claims. We need to find the silver mines Adrian mentions, locate the records of these forced property sales, and identify the person known as JM who appears to be carrying out the actual violence." Marcus nodded grimly. "I have contacts throughout the kingdom from my years of service. Former soldiers who now work as merchants, farmers, and tradesmen. If there is a pattern of intimidation and corruption, they will know about it." "Good," Elena said, "but we must be extremely careful about who we trust. This letter suggests that Adrian and Isabel have been building their network for some time. We don't know how many people in the palace, the noble houses, or even the royal guard might be involved." Rose, who had been listening quietly from her position by the door, suddenly spoke up. "Your Highness, there is something else. When I was leaving Prince Adrian's study, I heard voices in the corridor. Queen Isabel was speaking with someone I didn't recognize, a man with a rough voice and a northern accent. I couldn't hear most of what they said, but I did hear the Queen say something about the Blackwood problem and how it needed to be resolved permanently before the next council meeting. Elena and Marcus exchanged alarmed glances. The next council meeting is in 4 days, Elena said. Marcus's hand instinctively moved to the sword at his side. It seems they already suspect that someone in the royal guard might pose a threat to their plans. They may not know specifically that you've contacted me, but they're clearly concerned about the possibility. Elena felt a chill run through her. The web of corruption was even more extensive than she had imagined, and now it seemed that Marcus himself might already be in danger simply because of his reputation for integrity. We have 4 days to gather enough evidence to expose them, she said. 4 days to save the kingdom from their corruption, and possibly 4 days to save our own lives. Marcus stood at attention, his face set with the same determination Elena had seen when he led charges against enemy forces during the border wars. Your Highness, I pledge my life and my honor to this cause. Whatever the cost, we will not allow these crimes to continue. As the 3 conspirators began to plan their investigation, none of them noticed the shadowy figure that had been listening at the window or saw the person slip away into the darkness to report what they had overheard. The game was now in motion, and the stakes could not be higher. In 4 days, either justice would triumph, or the kingdom of Aldoria would fall completely under the control of those who saw power as nothing more than an opportunity for personal enrichment, regardless of the cost in human suffering. Elena looked out at the sleeping kingdom one more time before drawing the curtains closed. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. The morning sun cast long shadows across the palace courtyard as Elena made her way to the royal stables, her riding clothes chosen carefully to suggest nothing more than a princess seeking her daily exercise. She had barely slept after her midnight meeting with Captain Blackwood, her mind racing with plans and possibilities, but she knew that maintaining normal routines would be crucial to avoiding suspicion. Marcus was already waiting by the stables, his own horse saddled and ready. To any observer, he appeared to be nothing more than a dutiful guard captain ensuring the princess's safety during her morning ride. Only Elena could see the tension in his shoulders and the way his eyes constantly scanned their surroundings for potential threats. "Good morning, Captain," Elena said loudly enough for the stable boys to hear. "I thought I might ride to the eastern border today. The autumn colors are supposed to be particularly beautiful near Millbrook." "Of course, Your Highness," Marcus replied, helping her mount her mare. "I've taken the liberty of planning a route that will allow us to inspect some of the newer settlements along the way." As they rode out of the palace grounds, Elena felt a mix of excitement and terror. This was the most dangerous thing she had ever done, but it was also the most important. Every mile they traveled took them further from the safety of her royal chambers and deeper into a world where her title would provide no protection if they were discovered. Their first destination was the village of Millbrook, where, according to Adrian's letter, a merchant named Thomas Hartwell had recently sold his timber rights for far below market value after suffering a suspicious warehouse fire. Elena had met Thomas several times at palace functions, and she remembered him as a proud, honest man who had built his business through decades of hard work. The ride to Millbrook took nearly 2 hours, during which Marcus briefed Elena on what he had learned from his discreet inquiries the night before. 3 of his former soldiers, now working as merchants in different parts of the kingdom, had reported similar patterns of intimidation and forced sales. In each case, successful business owners had suffered mysterious setbacks followed by visits from well-dressed men offering to buy their properties at prices that barely covered their debts. "The pattern is too consistent to be coincidence," Marcus explained as they rode through the countryside. "And in each case, the new owners are connected to shell companies that ultimately trace back to investments managed by Queen Isabel's private financial advisors." Elena absorbed this information grimly. The corruption was even more systematic than she had feared. "Have you been able to identify the person signing as JM in Adrian's letter?" "I have suspicions, but no proof yet," Marcus replied. "There's a man named Jonas Murdoch who appeared at court about 2 years ago. He claims to be a land surveyor from the northern provinces, but some of my contacts remember him as a mercenary who was expelled from the royal army for excessive violence against prisoners. Jonas Murdoch, Elena repeated, committing the name to memory. If he's been working for Adrian and Isabel for 2 years, he would know where all the evidence is hidden. They approached Millbrook as the morning mist was beginning to lift from the surrounding fields. The village was smaller than Elena remembered, and there was an air of quiet desperation about the place that she had never noticed during her previous ceremonial visits. Thomas Hartwell's house stood at the center of the village, but where Elena remembered a prosperous-looking building with fresh paint and well-tended gardens, she now saw peeling shutters and overgrown walkways. The warehouse that had burned stood nearby, nothing more than a blackened foundation surrounded by weeds. They dismounted at the village inn, where Marcus arranged for their horses to be cared for while they conducted their business. The innkeeper, a middle-aged woman named Sarah, recognized Elena immediately despite her attempt to dress modestly. "Your Highness," Sarah exclaimed, dropping into a deep curtsy. "What an honor to have you visit our humble village." Elena smiled warmly and gestured for the woman to rise. "Please, there's no need for ceremony. I've come to speak with Thomas Hartwell about some business matters. Is he receiving visitors today?" Sarah's expression grew troubled. "Oh, Your Highness, I'm afraid Thomas isn't the man he used to be. Ever since the fire and, well, everything that followed, he's been quite different. Drinks too much, talks to himself, barely leaves his house except to tend his small garden." Elena exchanged a meaningful glance with Marcus. "Perhaps we could speak with him anyway. Sometimes people need to know that others care about their troubles." Sarah nodded eagerly. "Of course, Your Highness. I'm sure he would be honored by your visit, though I should warn you that he may not be entirely coherent. The man's been through terrible times." As they walked toward Thomas's house, Elena noticed how many of the other buildings in the village showed signs of neglect and abandonment. Several shops that had been thriving during her last visit were now boarded up, and the few people they passed on the streets looked away nervously when they saw her royal colors. Thomas Hartwell answered his door after several minutes of knocking, and Elena was shocked by his appearance. The proud, robust merchant she remembered had been replaced by a gaunt, hollow-eyed man who looked as if he had aged 20 years in the past few months. "Your Highness," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I wasn't expecting. Please come in." The inside of his house told the story of his downfall more clearly than any words could have. Furniture that Elena remembered as fine and well-crafted had been sold, leaving only the most basic necessities. The walls, once decorated with paintings and tapestries, were now bare except for a few faded portraits of Thomas's late wife. "Thomas," Elena said gently, settling into one of the remaining chairs. "I've come because I'm concerned about what happened to you. I know about the fire, and I want to understand how such a terrible thing could have occurred." Thomas looked at her with an expression that mixed gratitude with deep fear. "Your Highness, I appreciate your concern, but there are some things that are better left unspoken. I've learned to accept my circumstances and make the best of what I have left." Marcus stepped forward, his voice calm but authoritative. "Thomas, I am Captain Blackwood of the Royal Guard. We have reason to believe that what happened to you was not an accident, and that similar crimes have been committed against other honest citizens of the kingdom." At the mention of the Royal Guard, Thomas's demeanor changed completely. He sat up straighter and looked directly at Marcus with something approaching hope in his eyes. You think someone deliberately burned my warehouse?" "We think it's possible," Elena said, "but we need to know exactly what happened from the beginning." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, wrestling with some internal struggle. Finally, he began to speak, his voice growing stronger as he continued. "It started about 4 months ago. A man came to see me, well-dressed, said he represented some investors from the capital who were interested in acquiring timber rights throughout the eastern provinces. He offered me a price that was fair, but I wasn't interested in selling. My family had owned those rights for 3 generations, and the forest was sustainable enough to provide income for my children and grandchildren. Elena nodded encouragingly. What happened next? He came back several times, each time with a higher offer, but I kept refusing. Then, strange things started happening. Some of my workers reported seeing strangers in the forest, cutting trees without permission. When I went to investigate, I found that someone had been systematically damaging the younger trees, making them vulnerable to disease and pests. Marcus leaned forward. Did you report these incidents to the local authorities? Thomas laughed bitterly. The local magistrate told me that poaching was a common problem and that I should hire private security if I was concerned. He seemed remarkably uninterested in investigating who might be behind the vandalism. Elena felt her anger growing, but she kept her voice calm. Tell us about the fire. It happened on a Tuesday night in late summer. I had been working late in the warehouse, updating my inventory records. Around midnight, I smelled smoke and discovered that a section of the building was already engulfed in flames. By the time the volunteer fire brigade arrived, half of my stock was destroyed. Did you see anyone suspicious in the area that night? Marcus asked. That's the thing, Thomas said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. I could have sworn I saw someone running away from the building just as I discovered the fire, but when I reported it to the magistrate, he said I must have been mistaken. He suggested that the stress of my financial problems was making me imagine things. Elena's hands clenched into fists. The corruption clearly extended beyond the royal family into the local government structure. What financial problems? Thomas looked embarrassed. Well, that's where the story gets complicated, Your Highness. You see, about a week before the fire, I had received a letter from the royal treasury demanding immediate payment of back taxes that I supposedly owed. The amount was enormous, far more than my business had earned in the past 2 years. But surely you had records to prove that you had paid your taxes properly? Marcus said. That's exactly what I thought, but when I went to the treasury offices, they claimed that my previous payments had been improperly documented and that I would need to pay the full amount again while they conducted an investigation. The investigation could take months, and in the meantime, I would be charged interest and penalties. Elena realized she was looking at a sophisticated scheme designed to create financial pressure that would make victims desperate enough to accept any offer. So when your warehouse burned, I was facing financial ruin, Thomas confirmed. The insurance payment barely covered my outstanding debts, and I had no way to rebuild my inventory. When the same well-dressed man appeared at my door the next week, offering to buy my timber rights for enough money to pay off my taxes and have a small amount left over, I had no choice but to accept. Marcus stood and walked to the window, looking out at the burned remains of the warehouse. Thomas, can you describe this man who bought your timber rights? He was tall, probably in his 30s, with dark hair and a northern accent. He had a scar on his left hand, shaped like a crescent moon. Very polite, very professional, but there was something about his eyes. They were cold, like he was calculating exactly how much pressure to apply to break me. Elena felt her pulse quicken. The description matched what Rose had overheard about the man with a northern accent who had been speaking with Queen Isabel. Did he give you a name? He introduced himself as Mr. J. Morrison, representing the Northern Development Company. Marcus and Elena exchanged significant glances. J.M. Jonas Murdoch, operating under an alias that was probably close enough to his real name to avoid confusion, but different enough to provide plausible deniability. Thomas, Elena said, standing and moving closer to him. Well, I'm about to ask if you may put you in danger, but it may also be the only way to ensure that what happened to you doesn't happen to others. Would you be willing to testify about these events if we could guarantee your protection? Thomas looked at her with a mixture of hope and terror. Your Highness, if what you're suggesting is true, if someone in the government is behind these schemes, then testifying could be signing my death warrant. We understand the risk, Marcus said, but we also believe that these crimes go all the way to the top of the kingdom's power structure. If we can gather enough evidence and enough witnesses, we may be able to expose the entire conspiracy. Elena added, and if we do nothing, how many more innocent families will be destroyed? Thomas was quiet for a long time, staring at his hands. When he finally looked up, there was something like his old determination in his eyes. My wife always said that a man has to stand up for what's right, regardless of the personal cost. If my testimony can help stop these people from destroying other families the way they destroyed mine, then yes, Your Highness. I'll testify. Elena felt a surge of relief and admiration for this man who had already lost so much but was still willing to risk what little he had left for the sake of justice. Marcus pulled out a small notebook and began writing. Thomas, we're going to need you to document everything you can remember about your interactions with Morrison, the timeline of events, and any physical evidence you might still have. Letters, receipts, anything that could corroborate your story. I kept copies of everything, Thomas said, moving to a cabinet in the corner of the room. My wife always insisted on proper record keeping, and I suppose her habits saved me. He pulled out a thick folder filled with papers. Payment records, correspondence, insurance documents, even some sketches I made of the damage patterns in the warehouse. Elena looked through the documents quickly, her excitement growing. This was exactly the kind of detailed evidence they needed to build a case. But as she read, she also realized how carefully the conspiracy had been planned. Every legal document appeared to be in order, every transaction had the proper signatures and seals, and every step of the process had been designed to appear legitimate to casual observation. This is excellent work, Thomas, she said. But we need more than one case to expose the full scope of the conspiracy. Can you think of anyone else in the area who might have had similar experiences? Thomas nodded slowly. There's Martha Crenville, who lost her grain mills after a series of equipment failures that her workers swore were caused by sabotage. And Peter Ashford, whose cattle herd was poisoned just before a buyer appeared offering to purchase his land for a fraction of its value. Both of them were approached by the same Mr. Morrison after their troubles began. Marcus made notes of the names and locations. We'll need to speak with them as well, but we'll have to be extremely careful. If Morrison is watching for signs that people are talking, Elena stood and walked to the window, looking out at the village that had once been prosperous and was now struggling to survive. How many more villages like this are there throughout the kingdom? How many families have been destroyed while my father believes he's presiding over a time of economic growth and prosperity? The weight of responsibility settled on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. She was not just fighting to save her own life or even to expose her half-brother's crimes. She was fighting for the soul of the kingdom itself, for the principle that power should be used to protect the innocent rather than exploit them. As they prepared to leave Thomas's house, Elena made him a promise that she hoped she would be able to keep. Thomas, whatever happens in the coming days, I want you to know that your courage in speaking the truth will not be forgotten. If we succeed in exposing this conspiracy, you will be compensated for your losses and honored for your integrity. Thomas smiled for the first time since they had arrived. Your Highness, knowing that someone in authority actually cares about what happened to us is compensation enough. Just promise me that you'll be careful. These people have already shown that they're willing to destroy innocent lives to protect their schemes. They won't hesitate to hurt you if they discover what you're doing. As Elena and Marcus rode away from Millbrook, they both knew that they had crossed a line from which there could be no retreat. They now had evidence of criminal activity, a witness willing to testify, and the beginning of a pattern that could potentially bring down some of the most powerful people in the kingdom. But they also knew that time was running out. In 3 days, the royal council would meet, and according to Rose's overheard conversation, Queen Isabel planned to resolve the Blackwood problem permanently before then. Their next stop would be the village where Martha Crenville had lost her grain mills. But as they rode through the countryside, both Elena and Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The conspiracy they were investigating had eyes and ears everywhere, and their enemies were already taking steps to protect themselves. The investigation was no longer just about gathering evidence. It had become a race against time, with the very survival of the kingdom's moral foundation hanging in the balance. The village of Ashfeld lay nestled in a valley between rolling hills, its stone cottages and narrow streets, giving it a timeless quality that should have been peaceful. Instead, as Elena and Marcus approached Martha Crenville's former grain mill, they found themselves entering what felt like a ghost town. Many of the shops were closed, several houses stood empty with boards over their windows, and the few people they encountered on the streets moved quickly and avoided eye contact. Martha Crenville's mill sat beside a fast-flowing stream that had once powered the great wooden wheel, now standing motionless and partially collapsed. The building itself showed signs of recent abandonment, with broken windows and weeds growing through cracks in the stonework. They found Martha herself living in a small cottage behind the mill, tending a vegetable garden that seemed to be her primary source of sustenance. She was a woman in her 50s with prematurely gray hair and hands calloused from years of hard work. But her eyes still held the sharp intelligence that had once made her one of the most successful millers in the eastern provinces. When Elena introduced herself, Martha's reaction was immediate and startling. Instead of the usual deference shown to royalty, she stepped back with an expression of fear and suspicion. "Your Highness," Martha said carefully, "I'm honored by your visit, but I have to ask, why are you here, and why now?" Elena realized that Martha had every reason to be suspicious. From her perspective, the royal family had failed to protect her from the crimes that had destroyed her livelihood, and a sudden visit from a princess might seem like either mockery or a prelude to further persecution. "Martha," Elena said gently, "I'm here because I believe you were the victim of deliberate sabotage, and I want to help you get justice." Marcus stepped forward, showing his royal guard insignia. "We're investigating a pattern of crimes against honest business owners throughout the kingdom. We believe the same people who destroyed your mill have harmed many others." Martha studied their faces carefully before gesturing for them to sit on rough wooden benches beside her garden. "If what you're saying is true, then you're both in terrible danger. The people behind what happened to me have power that reaches into every level of government." Elena felt her pulse quicken. "What do you mean?" Martha looked around nervously, as if checking to make sure they weren't being overheard. "It started about 6 months ago. My mill was one of the most productive in the region, supplying grain processing services to farms throughout the valley. I had built the business over 20 years, and it provided good livings for myself and 8 workers." She paused, her hands clenching into fists at the memory. Then, a series of accidents began. First, the main grinding stone cracked in a way that my master craftsman said he had never seen in 30 years of mill work. The crack pattern was too precise, too perfectly placed to cause maximum damage. Marcus leaned forward. "Did you report your suspicions to anyone?" "I tried," Martha said bitterly. "The local magistrate said that equipment failures were normal in an industrial operation and that I should focus on repairs rather than looking for someone to blame. But the accidents kept happening. The water wheel's axle broke in 2 places simultaneously. The grain storage silos developed holes that allowed moisture to ruin entire harvests. Every time I repaired one problem, another would appear." Elena's anger was building, but she kept her voice calm. "How long did this continue?" 3 months of constant sabotage and mounting debts. My workers began to quit because I couldn't pay them regularly, and my customers started taking their business elsewhere because they couldn't rely on my equipment functioning properly." Martha stood and walked toward the ruined mill, her voice growing stronger as she continued. "The final blow came when someone poisoned the water supply to my mill pond. Not enough to hurt anyone, but enough to contaminate several batches of flour. When word spread that my mill had produced tainted products, my remaining customers abandoned me immediately. And then someone appeared offering to buy your property?" Marcus asked. "The very next day," Martha confirmed. "A well-dressed man with a northern accent who introduced himself as J. Morrison. He claimed to represent investors who specialized in acquiring and renovating industrial properties. His offer was barely enough to cover my debts, but by then I had no choice." Elena and Marcus exchanged glances. The same pattern, the same perpetrator, the same calculated destruction of people's lives. "Martha," Did this J. Morrison ever mention where his investors came from or who they represented? He was very careful not to give specific details, but he did let slip one thing that seemed odd at the time. When I asked about his timeline for renovating the mill, he said that his employers were working on several similar projects throughout the kingdom and that they had political connections that would help them navigate any regulatory obstacles. Marcus made notes quickly. Political connections. Did he elaborate on that? He said that his company had the backing of people close to the royal family, and that they could expedite any permits or approvals needed for major renovations. At the time, I thought he was just boasting to justify his low offer. Elena felt a chill run through her. The conspiracy wasn't just using Adrian and Isabel's resources. It was actively trading on the royal family's reputation to intimidate victims and corrupt officials. Martha, Elena said, we have evidence that connects these crimes to people in positions of great power, possibly including members of the royal family itself. If we can gather enough proof to expose the entire conspiracy, would you be willing to testify about what happened to you? Martha was quiet for a long time, staring at her ruined mill. When she finally spoke, her voice was filled with a mixture of hope and determination. Your Highness, I've lost everything I spent my life building. My workers have scattered to find jobs in other towns, my customers have forgotten me, and I'm living on what I can grow in my garden. If my testimony could prevent this from happening to others, then, yes, I'll testify. Marcus pulled out his notebook again. We'll need detailed records of everything that happened, including dates, descriptions of the damage, and any correspondence you might have had with Morrison or his associates. Martha nodded and led them into her cottage, where she produced a wooden chest filled with carefully organized documents. I may have lost my mill, but I never lost my habit of keeping proper records. Every repair bill, every lost customer, every conversation with officials who refused to help, it's all documented. As Elena reviewed Martha's records, she was struck by how meticulously the sabotage had been planned. The equipment failures were spaced just far enough apart to seem like coincidences to casual observers, but close enough together to create maximum financial pressure. The poisoning of the water supply was timed perfectly to coincide with Martha's largest orders of the year, ensuring maximum damage to her reputation. This level of planning suggests inside knowledge, Elena observed. Someone had to understand your business operations intimately to know exactly when and how to cause the most damage. Martha's face darkened. I've thought about that many times. There was a man named David Thornfield who had worked for me for about a year before the troubles began. He was knowledgeable about mill operations and seemed eager to learn every aspect of the business. What happened to him? Marcus asked. He disappeared about a week before the first equipment failure. Said he'd found a better opportunity with a mill in the northern provinces. I was disappointed to lose him, but I wished him well. Elena and Marcus looked at each other with growing understanding. Martha, can you describe this David Thornfield? Medium height, brown hair, always asking questions about the mill's vulnerabilities. He was particularly interested in the structural weak points of the equipment and the water supply system. Martha paused, her face growing pale as the implications became clear. You think he was a spy, don't you? You think he was working for them from the beginning? It's possible, Elena said gently. These people have been planning their operations for a long time, and they would need inside information to be so effective. Marcus stood and walked to the window, his soldier's instincts alerting him to potential danger. If they've been placing spies in businesses they plan to target, then they have an extensive network of operatives throughout the kingdom. Elena felt the full weight of what they were uncovering. This wasn't just a case of corruption and extortion. It was a systematic campaign to destroy the kingdom's independent merchant class and concentrate economic power in the hands of Adrian and Isabel's criminal organization. Martha, we need to ask you something very important, Elena said. Have you noticed anyone watching you or asking questions about you since Morrison bought your property? Martha nodded grimly. There have been strangers in the village asking about my situation, claiming to be sympathetic to my plight. but their questions seemed more focused on whether I had spoken to anyone in authority about what happened to me. Marcus moved away from the window and spoke in a low, urgent voice. We may not be safe here. If they're monitoring Martha, they may already know about our visit. Elena's mind raced through their options. They needed more evidence, but they also needed to protect their witnesses and themselves. Martha, would you be willing to come with us to a secure location where you can document your testimony without fear of intimidation? Where would be safe? Martha asked. If these people have political connections at the highest levels, is anywhere truly secure? Elena realized that Martha was right to be concerned. The palace itself might not be safe, given that Adrian and Isabel lived there and had access to information about everyone who came and went. They needed a location that was both secure and beyond the immediate reach of the conspiracy. There's a monastery about a day's ride from here, Marcus suggested. The abbot is a man I served with during the border wars, and the monastery has a tradition of providing sanctuary to those seeking justice. It will be difficult for anyone to threaten you there without causing a major scandal. Martha looked around her cottage, at the simple life she had built from the ruins of her former prosperity. If I go with you, there's no guarantee I'll be able to return here safely, is there? Elena couldn't bring herself to lie. No, Martha. If we succeed in exposing this conspiracy, you'll be safe and probably compensated for your losses. But if you fail, I'll probably be dead whether I help you or not, Martha finished. These people don't leave loose ends, and they know I have evidence of their crimes. She stood and moved to her chest of documents, pulling out the most important papers and wrapping them in oiled cloth. Your Highness, I've spent 6 months feeling helpless and afraid. If you're offering me a chance to fight back, then I'll take it. As they prepared to leave Martha's cottage, Elena felt a surge of admiration for the woman's courage. Like Thomas Hartwell, Martha was willing to risk her life for the principle of justice, even though she had already lost so much. But as they loaded Martha's essential belongings onto a spare horse that Marcus had acquired in the village, Elena noticed movement on the hills surrounding Eschfeld. Several riders were positioned at strategic points, too far away to identify, but close enough to observe anyone entering or leaving the village. Marcus, Elena said quietly, we're being watched. Marcus followed her gaze and immediately began assessing their tactical situation. There are at least 4 mounted observers positioned to cut off the main roads out of the valley. If we try to leave by the obvious routes, we'll be intercepted. Martha overheard their conversation, and her face grew pale. There's an old shepherd's path that leads up into the hills behind my cottage. It's steep and dangerous, but it connects to the main road about 5 miles north of here. Elena realized they had no choice but to take the risk. If they were captured now, all of their evidence would be lost, and their witnesses would be silenced permanently. Show us the path, she said to Martha. We'll have to trust that our horses can handle the terrain. As they led their horses up the narrow, winding path through dense forest and rocky outcroppings, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. The conspiracy had demonstrated its ability to anticipate and counter every move made by its victims, and she feared that their escape route might already be known to their enemies. Marcus took the lead position, his hand never straying far from his sword hilt, while Elena stayed close to Martha to help her navigate the treacherous path. The afternoon sun was beginning to sink toward the western horizon, and Elena realized that they would be traveling in darkness before they reached the safety of the monastery. Behind them, the riders who had been watching the village were now moving, following their trail up the mountainside. The hunt had begun, and the stakes had never been higher. As they climbed higher into the hills, Martha shared more details about the systematic destruction of Ashfeld's economy. The grain mill had been just one part of a larger operation that had targeted the village's blacksmith, weaver, and cooper within the same 6-month period. Each had suffered mysterious accidents and equipment failures before being approached by J. Morrison with offers to buy their businesses. The entire village economy was destroyed in less than a year, Martha explained as they navigated a particularly steep section of the path. Families that had lived here for generations were forced to leave, and now the place is practically deserted. Elena realized that what they were witnessing was not just individual crimes, but the systematic depopulation and economic conquest of entire communities. Adrian and Isabel weren't just stealing from individual merchants. They were reshaping the economic landscape of the kingdom to serve their own interests. The implications were staggering. If this pattern was being repeated throughout the kingdom, then thousands of families had been destroyed while King William remained oblivious to the suffering being caused by his own wife and stepson. As darkness fell and they continued their dangerous journey toward the monastery, Elena made a silent vow. Whatever the personal cost, she would expose this conspiracy and restore justice to the kingdom of Aldoria. The innocent people who had been destroyed by Adrian and Isabel's greed deserved nothing less than the truth, and the truth was exactly what Elena intended to give them. But first, they had to survive the night and reach sanctuary before their pursuers could overtake them. The path ahead was treacherous. Their enemies were closing in, and time was rapidly running out. The monastery of St. Aldrich stood like a fortress against the night sky, its ancient stone walls and high towers offering the promise of sanctuary to Elena, Marcus, and Martha as they approached through the darkness. Their harrowing journey through the mountain paths had taken longer than expected, and their horses were exhausted from the treacherous terrain. More importantly, they could still see torches moving through the forest behind them, evidence that their pursuers had not given up the chase. Abbot Benedict met them at the monastery gates, a tall, weathered man whose calm demeanor spoke of someone who had faced danger many times before. Marcus had sent word ahead through a network of former soldiers, and the abbot had been expecting them. "Captain Blackwood," the abbot said, embracing Marcus warmly. "It has been too long since you graced us with your presence. Though I understand this visit is under somewhat different circumstances than your usual pilgrimages." Marcus nodded grimly. "Benedict, we need sanctuary for these ladies and protection for evidence that could expose corruption at the highest levels of the kingdom. The people chasing us are willing to kill to protect their secrets." The abbot's expression grew serious as he looked at Elena, recognizing her despite her travel-stained clothes and exhausted appearance. "Your Highness, you are most welcome here. The monastery has provided sanctuary to those seeking justice for 800 years, and we will not break that tradition now." Elena felt a wave of relief as the heavy gates closed behind them, and she heard the sound of iron bars being slotted into place. For the first time in days, she felt truly safe. The abbot led them to his private chambers, where a warm fire and simple meal were waiting. As they ate and recovered from their ordeal, Elena and Marcus took turns explaining the full scope of what they had discovered. The abbot listened without interruption, his face growing increasingly troubled as he learned about the systematic destruction of innocent families throughout the kingdom. "What you describe is not merely criminal," the abbot said when they had finished their account. "It is a fundamental violation of the sacred trust between rulers and subjects. If Prince Adrian and Queen Isabel are indeed responsible for these crimes, then they have forfeited any legitimate claim to power." Martha, who had been quietly organizing her documents, looked up with a mixture of hope and fear. "Father Abbot, do you truly believe that people like us can stand against those who have such power and influence?" The abbot smiled kindly. "My dear woman, history teaches us that the truth has a power all its own. When good people stand together and refuse to be silenced, even the mightiest tyrants can be brought to account." Elena felt encouraged by his words, but she also knew that they still had enormous challenges ahead of them. "Father, we have testimony from 2 victims and 1 letter that proves Prince Adrian's involvement, but we need more evidence to convince my father and the royal council." Marcus pulled out his notes and spread them on the table. "I've been thinking about our next steps. We need to identify more victims who are willing to testify locate the hidden silver mines mentioned in Adrian's letter, and, most importantly, find this Jonas Murdoch character who has been carrying out the actual violence. The abbot studied Marcus's notes carefully. I may be able to help you with that last item. We have brothers who travel throughout the kingdom, ministering to remote communities, and they often hear things that don't reach official ears. If there is a man matching Murdoch's description terrorizing merchants and landowners, our brothers would likely know about it. Elena felt a surge of hope. That could be exactly what we need. If we can locate Murdoch and convince him to testify, he would never testify voluntarily, Marcus interrupted. Men like that are loyal only to whoever pays them the most. But if we could capture him and present evidence of his crimes, we might be able to force his cooperation. As they continued planning their next moves, Elena became aware of voices outside the abbot's chambers. At first, she assumed it was simply the evening prayers being conducted in the monastery chapel, but the voices seemed to be growing louder and more agitated. The abbot excused himself to investigate, returning several minutes later with a troubled expression. It seems we have visitors at the gate. A group of armed men claiming to represent the royal household, demanding that we turn over fugitives who have stolen crown property. Elena's blood ran cold. They followed us here. But how did they track us through the mountain paths and darkness? Marcus was already moving toward his weapons. It doesn't matter how they found us. What matters is that they're here, and they're not going to accept the monastery's right of sanctuary. Through the window, Elena could see torches surrounding the monastery walls. There had to be at least 20 armed men, far more than the monks could resist if it came to violence. The abbot moved to a cabinet and withdrew a sword that looked surprisingly well-maintained for a man of peace. Gentlemen, I served in the king's army for 15 years before I took my vows. I have not forgotten how to defend the innocent against those who would do them harm. Elena realized that their enemies had made a tactical error. By bringing armed men to violate the sanctuary of a monastery, they were committing a crime that would shock the entire kingdom if it became public knowledge. But they clearly believed they could eliminate all witnesses and cover up their actions. Father, Elena said, is there another way out of the monastery? If we could escape while they're focused on the main gate. The abbot nodded. There's an old tunnel that connects the wine cellar to a cave system in the hillside. It was built during the civil wars 3 centuries ago to allow the brothers to evacuate if the monastery was besieged. Marcus began gathering their essential documents and supplies. How long would it take them to realize we had escaped? Long enough for you to reach the main road, but not long enough to reach safety, the abbot replied. You would need somewhere to go, somewhere they couldn't follow. Elena thought quickly. There was one place that might offer them protection, but it would require taking an enormous risk. Marcus, what do you know about Lord Geoffrey Ashworth? Marcus looked surprised by the question. He's one of the most respected members of the Royal Council, known for his integrity and his loyalty to your father. Why? Because if we're going to expose this conspiracy, we need someone with the political power to ensure our evidence reaches the king. Lord Ashworth has land about a day's ride from here, and he has his own private guards who answer to no one but him. The abbot understood immediately. You're suggesting that you reveal everything to Lord Ashworth and ask him to help you present your case to the king. It's risky, Elena admitted. If Lord Ashworth is involved in the conspiracy, we'll be delivering ourselves directly to our enemies. But if he's truly loyal to my father, he's our best hope of getting justice. Martha, who had been listening to their debate with growing anxiety, spoke up. Your Highness, I'm just a simple miller, but it seems to me that we don't have many choices. These people have found us here, and they'll find us wherever we go unless we can expose them publicly. Marcus nodded grimly. Martha's right. We can keep running, but eventually they'll corner us. Our only real option is to take the offensive and force a confrontation on our terms. The sound of voices outside was growing more demanding, and Elena could hear the monastery's bells beginning to ring in alarm. The abbot's face was set in lines of determination as he prepared to defend his sanctuary against those who would violate it. Very well, Elena said. We'll use the tunnel to escape, make our way to Lord Ashworth's estate and present him with everything we've discovered. If he proves trustworthy, we'll ask him to help us arrange a formal presentation to the Royal Council. If he proves to be part of the conspiracy, then we'll improvise. Marcus finished. It won't be the first time I've had to fight my way out of an impossible situation. The abbot led them quickly through the monastery's corridors to a concealed entrance in the wine cellar. As he showed them the beginning of the tunnel system, he pressed a small leather pouch into Elena's hands. Gold coins, enough to purchase fresh horses and supplies, he explained. And this. He handed her a sealed letter. My personal testimony about what you have shared with me tonight. If something happens to you, at least there will be a record of the truth. Elena felt tears stinging her eyes as she realized the full extent of what this holy man was risking for them. Father, thank you. Your courage will not be forgotten. The abbot smiled. Your Highness, you are your father's daughter in all the best ways. The kingdom is fortunate to have someone willing to fight for justice, regardless of the personal cost. As they entered the narrow tunnel, Elena could hear the sound of breaking wood from the direction of the monastery gates. Their enemies had decided that intimidation was insufficient and were now resorting to outright violence against the Holy Brothers. The tunnel was dark, damp, and barely wide enough for one person to walk upright. They moved single file through the ancient passageway, guided only by the small lamp that Marcus carried. The sound of their footsteps echoed off the stone walls, and Elena found herself praying that the tunnel would indeed lead them to safety rather than into a trap. After what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, they emerged into a natural cave that opened onto a hillside overlooking the valley. The monastery was visible in the distance, surrounded by torches and clearly under siege. Elena felt sick knowing that the brothers were suffering because they had provided sanctuary to her and her companions. Martha pointed toward lights moving through the forest. They're searching for us. How long before they discover the tunnel? Marcus studied the terrain carefully. We need to move quickly, but we also need to avoid the search parties. There's a stream that runs parallel to the road about a mile from here. If we follow it, we can stay hidden while making progress toward Lord Ashworth's estate. As they began their journey through the darkness, Elena reflected on how much her life had changed in just a few days. She had gone from a sheltered princess, concerned mainly with charity work, to a fugitive carrying evidence of treason against her own family members. But she had also discovered something about herself that she had never known before. When faced with injustice and corruption, she was willing to risk everything to fight for what was right. The comfortable life of a royal princess held no appeal if it meant turning a blind eye to the suffering of her father's subjects. The stream was icy cold, and the rocks were slippery, making their progress slow and treacherous. But it provided the concealment they needed, and Marcus's military experience helped them avoid the search parties that were combing the hillsides with increasing desperation. As dawn began to break over the eastern mountains, Elena caught sight of Lord Ashworth's estate in the distance. The manor house was impressive but not ostentatious, surrounded by well-tended fields and guarded by men who looked competent and alert. There it is, she said, pointing toward their destination. In a few hours, we'll know whether Lord Ashworth is our salvation or our doom. Marcus checked his weapons one more time. Elena, I want you to know that whatever happens, I'm honored to have served with you in this cause. You've shown courage that would impress the most experienced soldiers I've known. Martha nodded in agreement. Your Highness, you've given me hope that justice is still possible, even for people like me who have nothing left to lose. Elena felt the weight of their trust and determination. In a few hours, she would either be presenting her evidence to someone who could help her save the kingdom, or she would be facing the final confrontation with the forces that sought to destroy everything she held dear. As they approached Lord Ashworth's estate in the growing light of morning, Elena made a silent promise to all those who had suffered under Adrian and Isabel's reign of terror. Whatever the cost, she would see justice done. The truth would be revealed, and those responsible would be held accountable for their crimes. The final gamble was about to begin. Lord Geoffrey Ashworth stood in the doorway of his manor house, his weathered face showing both surprise and concern as he recognized the bedraggled figures approaching his estate. Elena had met him many times at court functions, and she had always been impressed by his reputation for honesty and fairness. Now she was about to discover whether that reputation was deserved or merely a carefully constructed facade. "Your Highness," Lord Ashworth said, stepping forward to help Elena dismount from her exhausted horse. "You look as though you've been through a considerable ordeal. Please, come inside where we can speak privately." Elena studied his face carefully, looking for any sign of deception or hidden agenda. What she saw was genuine concern mixed with curiosity about why a princess would arrive at his estate unannounced, accompanied by a captain of the royal guard and a woman he didn't recognize. Lord Ashworth's wife, Lady Catherine, appeared at his side and immediately took charge of seeing that their unexpected guests were provided with food, clean clothes, and medical attention for the various cuts and bruises they had sustained during their escape through the mountains. "Geoffrey," Lady Catherine said quietly to her husband, "these people have clearly been in danger. Whatever brought them here, they need our protection." Elena felt encouraged by Lady Catherine's instinctive hospitality, but she knew that the real test would come when she revealed the true purpose of their visit. After they had cleaned up and eaten their first proper meal in days, Lord Ashworth led them to his private study, where the walls were lined with law books and the atmosphere spoke of serious deliberation on matters of justice and governance. "Now then, Your Highness," Lord Ashworth said, settling into a chair opposite Elena, "I suspect this is not a social call. What brings you to my estate under such dramatic circumstances?" Elena took a deep breath, knowing that the next few minutes would determine not only her own fate, but potentially the future of the entire kingdom. "Lord Ashworth, what I am about to tell you will shock you, but I need you to hear me out completely before you make any judgments." She began with the discovery of Adrian's letter, watching Lord Ashworth's face carefully as she described the evidence of systematic corruption and violence. His expression grew increasingly grave as she continued with the testimonies of Thomas Hartwell and Martha Crenville, and when she finished with their escape from the monastery, his face was set in lines of deep anger. "If what you are telling me is true," Lord Ashworth said slowly, "then we are dealing with treason on a scale that threatens the very foundations of the kingdom." Marcus leaned forward. "My lord, we have documented evidence of everything Princess Elena has described. The pattern is too consistent and too widespread to be anything other than a coordinated criminal enterprise." Lord Ashworth stood and walked to his window, looking out at his own lands with a new understanding of the threats facing honest landowners throughout the kingdom. "I have to confess, Your Highness, that your revelations explain several things that have puzzled me in recent months." Elena felt her pulse quicken. "What do you mean?" "There have been several occasions during royal council meetings when Prince Adrian has proposed new policies that seem designed to benefit specific business interests rather than the kingdom as a whole. When I questioned the wisdom of these proposals, Queen Isabel would always have detailed financial projections that made the policies appear beneficial." Marcus made a note of this information. "Did you ever wonder where those projections came from?" "I assumed they were prepared by the Royal Treasury's economic advisors," Lord Ashworth replied. "But now I realize they may have been fabricated to support decisions that had already been made for other reasons." Martha, who had been quietly listening to the conversation, spoke up. "My lord, if you've seen this pattern in the Royal Council, then you know that the corruption goes beyond just stealing from individual merchants. They're manipulating royal policy to serve their criminal enterprises." Lord Ashworth turned back to face them, his expression resolute. "If this conspiracy is as extensive as you suggest, then we cannot simply present your evidence to the king and expect him to act upon it. Queen Isabel has had years to build her influence over him, and Prince Adrian is his heir. The king will be reluctant to believe accusations against his own family without overwhelming proof." Elena had been thinking about this problem throughout their journey. "That's why we need to present our case publicly, in a way that makes it impossible for my father to ignore or suppress. What did you have in mind? Lord Ashworth asked. Marcus spoke up. The Harvest Festival is in 2 days. Representatives from every major city and town in the kingdom will be gathered in the capital for the traditional celebration. If we could present our evidence during the public ceremonies. Elena nodded enthusiastically. The king would be forced to address the accusations publicly, and Queen Isabel and Adrian wouldn't be able to silence us without creating a scandal that would destroy their credibility. Lord Ashworth considered this proposal carefully. It's risky, but it might be our only option. However, we'll need more than just testimony and documents. We'll need to produce Jonas Murdoch himself, and we'll need evidence of the hidden silver mines mentioned in Adrian's letter. Elena felt a surge of excitement as she realized that Lord Ashworth was not only believing their accusations, but was actively helping them plan how to expose the conspiracy. Do you have any ideas about how we might locate Murdoch? Lord Ashworth moved to his desk and pulled out a detailed map of the kingdom. Actually, I think I might. There have been reports from several northern provinces about a man matching Murdoch's description who has been involved in various incidents of intimidation and violence. My own agents have been trying to track him down because some of his activities have affected landowners who are vassals of mine. He pointed to several locations on the map. If the pattern holds, he should be operating somewhere in this region within the next few days. There's a mining town called Greyhold, where several suspicious accidents have occurred recently. Elena's eyes widened. Greyhold, that's the location mentioned in Adrian's letter as the source of the hidden silver mines. Marcus studied the map carefully. If we could get to Greyhold and capture Murdoch while he's in the act of committing these crimes, we would have the evidence we need to prove the entire conspiracy. Lord Ashworth nodded. And if we move quickly, we might be able to bring him back to the capital in time for the Harvest Festival. Elena realized that they were planning something extremely dangerous, but also something that could finally bring justice to all the people who had suffered under Adrian and Isabel's criminal enterprise. Lord Ashworth, she said, if we do this, you'll be putting yourself and your family at enormous risk. If we fail, Your Highness, Lord Ashworth interrupted, I took an oath to serve the kingdom and protect its people from all enemies, foreign and domestic. If members of the royal family have become enemies of the people they were meant to protect, then my duty is clear. Lady Catherine, who had been listening from the doorway, stepped into the room. Geoffrey is right, Your Highness. We cannot stand by and allow this corruption to continue, regardless of the personal cost. Elena felt a wave of gratitude and admiration for this couple who were willing to risk everything for the sake of justice. Then we're agreed. We'll travel to Greyhold, capture Murdoch, and gather evidence of the illegal mining operations, and return to the capital in time to expose the entire conspiracy during the Harvest Festival. Marcus began planning their mission with the precision of an experienced soldier. We'll need reliable horses, weapons, and men who can be trusted completely. How many guards can you spare, Lord Ashworth? I can give you 6 of my best men, all veterans who have served with me for years. They understand the importance of loyalty and discretion. Martha looked nervous about the prospect of traveling to another dangerous location, but her voice was steady when she spoke. Your Highness, I want to come with you to Greyhold. If Murdoch is there, I want to face him and tell him exactly what his actions did to my life and the lives of my workers. Elena admired Martha's courage, but she was also concerned about putting the woman in further danger. Martha, you've already done more than enough. You don't need to risk yourself again. With respect, Your Highness, Martha replied, this isn't just about revenge. If we're going to convince people that this conspiracy is real, they need to see the human cost. They need to hear from someone who lost everything because of these criminals. Lord Ashworth stood and moved to a cabinet where he kept his weapons. Then it's settled. We leave for Greyhold at first light. Captain Blackwood, I'll provide you with a letter of authority that will allow you to make arrests in my name. It's not perfect legal cover, but it should protect us from immediate retaliation. Elena felt the familiar mixture of excitement and terror that had become her constant companion since this adventure began. In less than 24 hours, they would either have the evidence they needed to bring down the conspiracy, or they would all be dead. As they spent the evening preparing for their mission, Elena reflected on how much she had changed since discovering Adrian's letter. The sheltered princess who had once worried mainly about charity functions and court ceremonies was gone, replaced by someone who was willing to fight for justice regardless of the personal cost. She thought about her father, sleeping peacefully in the palace while his wife and stepson destroyed the kingdom he thought he was protecting. Tomorrow's mission would determine whether King William would finally learn the truth about the people he trusted most, or whether the corruption would continue to spread until the entire kingdom was under the control of criminals. The next morning dawned clear and cold, perfect weather for the hard ride to Greyhold. Elena, Marcus, Martha, Lord Ashworth, and his 6 trusted guards set out at sunrise, their horses fresh and their weapons ready. As they rode through the countryside, Elena couldn't help but notice signs of the conspiracy's impact everywhere she looked. Abandoned farms, boarded-up shops, and villages with too few people suggested that the economic destruction they had witnessed in Millbrook and Ashfeld was being repeated throughout the kingdom. By late afternoon, they could see the smoke from Greyhold's mining operations rising into the sky. The town itself was larger than Elena had expected, with several mine shafts visible on the surrounding hillsides and a substantial population of workers and their families. Lord Ashworth had contacts in Greyhold who confirmed that Jonas Murdoch was indeed in the area, operating under the name J. Morrison and staying at the town's largest inn. More importantly, they learned that he was planning to meet with the mine foreman that very evening to discuss increasing production quotas and reducing safety expenditures. Elena realized that they had arrived at the perfect moment to catch Murdoch in the act of implementing the criminal policies described in Adrian's letter. As darkness fell over Greyhold, Elena, Marcus, and their allies positioned themselves around the inn where Murdoch was staying. The plan was simple: capture him during his meeting, secure any documents he might be carrying, and force him to reveal the full scope of the conspiracy. But as Elena waited in the shadows outside the inn, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The meeting had been scheduled for 8 o'clock, but it was now nearly 9, and there had been no sign of activity in the inn's private dining room. Marcus appeared at her side, his face grim. Something's not right. Lord Ashworth contact says Murdoch left the inn an hour ago with several armed men, claiming he had received urgent orders from his employers. Elena's blood ran cold. They know we're here. Someone warned them. Before Marcus could respond, they heard the sound of horses approaching rapidly from several directions. Elena realized with horror that they were about to be surrounded by the same kind of armed force that had attacked the monastery. "It's a trap," Marcus said, drawing his sword. "They lured us here knowing we would try to capture Murdoch." Elena felt panic rising in her chest, but then she remembered all the innocent people who were counting on her to expose the conspiracy. Thomas Hartwell, Martha Crenville, the abbot and his brothers, and countless others who had suffered under Adrian and Isabel's criminal enterprise. "Marcus," she said, her voice steady despite her fear, "we may not be able to capture Murdoch tonight, but we can still expose the illegal mining operation. If we can get evidence of the hidden silver extraction, it will be enough to support our case." Marcus nodded grimly. "Lord Ashworth and his men are holding the perimeter. If we can reach the mine offices, we might find the records we need." Elena knew that what they were planning was essentially suicide. They were outnumbered, surrounded, and far from any help. But they were also closer than they had ever been to proving the conspiracy that had destroyed so many lives. As they crept through the shadows toward the mine offices, Elena made a silent vow to everyone who had trusted her with their stories and their lives. Even if she died tonight, the truth would somehow find a way to survive and bring justice to the kingdom of Aldoria. The final confrontation was about to begin, and Elena was ready to face whatever came next.